The morning light barely filtered through the blinds in the briefing room. Merritt Caldwell sat in his usual seat in the third row, stirring his coffee as it cooled. 15 years on the highway patrol had made these meetings routine, but today, something was different. Standing against the wall was an unfamiliar woman in an ironed uniform tall, with her red hair gathered in a tight bun. Sergeant Brooks introduced the new officer, Sage Donovan, a transfer from the Northern District. Merritt noted her confident gait as she walked to the vacant seat and the faint smile that touched the corners of her lips in response to her colleagues' greetings. "Caldwell, show the rookie around our station," the sergeant instructed after the briefing. Merritt nodded, noting to himself that Donovan frowned slightly at the word rookie. The first few hours of the patrol passed in professional silence, Sage driving confidently, occasionally checking the map of the area on her tablet. They'd stopped a couple of speeders in the afternoon, and Merritt noted how smoothly she worked. No fuss, everything according to protocol. 5 years on patrol, Sage said, as if reading his mind. Just different roads. By evening, Merritt already knew she'd grown up in Oregon, graduated from the police academy with honors, and moved here because of her divorce. That last detail stuck in his mind for some reason. Silence greeted him at home. Aiden was sitting in the living room, tucked into her laptop, another report for the insurance company. She looked up when he walked in, smiled her usual smile. "How was your day?" "The usual, new partner." "Yeah? How's he doing?" "She is. Sage Donovan. Seems savvy." Aiden nodded and went back to work. Merritt went upstairs to the shower. The hot jets hit his shoulders, and for some reason the confident smile of his red-headed partner stood before his eyes. He shook his head, pushing away the unwelcome vision. 15 years of marriage had taught him to appreciate the safe harbor Aiden had created. But something had subtly changed that day, as if a new, unsettling note had been woven into the measured melody of his life. As he fell asleep beside his wife, Merritt thought that for some reason tomorrow's duty was giving him a strange excitement he hadn't felt in years. October painted the trees along the highway gold and purple. It had been 3 weeks since Sage had been at the station, and Merritt found himself thinking that the morning meetings no longer seemed routine. He'd learned to notice the details, the way she fixed a loose strand of hair, the way she drummed her fingers on her clipboard during long briefings, the way she squinted at the road on bright, sunny days. Their shifts had become an unspoken ritual. Coffee at old Jim's gas station, leisurely conversations while on patrol, the occasional joke only the two of them could understand. Sage turned out to be a great listener. She never interrupted, only occasionally asked precise questions that made Merritt think about things he'd long taken for granted. That afternoon, they were doing paperwork on a serious accident on the highway. In the cramped patrol car, their hands casually touched over a file of reports. Merritt felt goosebumps run down his skin. Sage froze for a moment, then slowly removed her hand. A thick silence hung in the cabin. "You know," Sage broke the silence, "sometimes I feel like my whole life is an endless road. Everyone's moving somewhere, and I'm just watching." Merritt looked at her profile, clearly outlined by the setting sun. His throat went dry. "And sometimes I feel like I've been standing on the side of the road for 15 years, he replied before he could think. When he got home that evening, he sat in the car in front of the house for a long time. Aiden was waiting for him with dinner, as flawless, predictable, and kind-hearted as ever. She talked about problems at work, about weekend plans, about fixing the leaky faucet in the bathroom. Merritt nodded, but his thoughts were far away. At night, he couldn't sleep. Sage's face was in front of his eyes, her easy gait, the way she threw back her head laughing at his jokes. He remembered their conversations, about books, about music, about places they wanted to visit. With Aiden, they had long ago stopped talking about such things. The next morning, Sage brought him coffee, black, 2 spoonfuls of sugar, just the way he liked it. Their fingers touched again, and this time it wasn't an accident. While on patrol, they stopped on a deserted stretch of road. The fall wind was driving yellow leaves across the asphalt. Sage turned toward him, and Merritt saw in her eyes a reflection of her own longing and desire. "We shouldn't," he said, but it sounded unconvincing even to himself. "I know," she replied. and there was more honesty in those 2 words than in all his conversations with Aiden over the past year. Returning home that evening, Merritt realized he was standing on the edge of a precipice. 15 years of marriage, a reputation in the precinct, a well-established life, all of it suddenly seemed like cardboard scenery. All that was real was this new, heady feeling that took his breath away. Aiden met him with news of her parents' upcoming visit. He listened, nodded, smiled, and one thought pounded in his head. Tomorrow, he would see Sage again. At night, he dreamed of an endless road and red hair fluttering in the wind. He woke up in a cold sweat, realizing he couldn't pretend nothing was happening anymore. Something was irreversibly changing in his life, and he didn't know whether to be glad or afraid of it. The night watch was quiet. A light rain shrouded the streets in a misty haze, and the occasional car floated by like a ghost. Merritt and Sage parked in their usual spot at an abandoned gas station, where the dangerous curve of the highway was clearly visible. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the walkie-talkie and the measured tap of droplets on the roof. Sage sat motionless, staring straight ahead. In the dim light of the dashboard, her profile seemed carved in marble. "You know," she said suddenly, "I never wanted to be that woman, the one who destroys other people's families." Merritt felt his heart clench. The last few weeks had become torture. Every glance, every casual touch was filled with unspoken meaning. They were both teetering on the edge, hesitant to take a step forward or back. "I never thought I'd be in this situation either," he replied hoarsely. Sage turned toward him. Her eyes reflected the lights of the occasional car. "What are we doing, Merritt?" Instead of answering, he reached for her. Their lips met in a kiss as desperate and inevitable as a lightning strike. Time stopped. There was only the 2 of them, the rain outside the window, and that dizzying feeling of falling. He didn't go home after his shift. They sat in a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, drinking tasteless coffee and talking about their fears, about unfulfilled dreams, about how life had brought them to this moment. "Things died down with Aiden a long time ago," Merritt admitted. "We just keep living together out of inertia, like neighbors who've gotten too used to each other." Sage covered his hand with hers. "I won't rush you, but I can't keep going on like this either." The next few days turned into an elaborate torture. At work, they tried to remain professional. Sage began to socialize with the other officers more often, as if building a protective wall. Merritt caught curious glances from his co-workers. Someone suspected something already? At home, it was getting harder and harder to play the role of the model husband. Aiden sensed the change in him, but she put it down to stress at work. She tried to cheer him up, suggesting weekend trips out of town, signing up for joint dances. Each of her attempts caused Merritt a muffled irritation, which he immediately ate up with guilt. At night, he lay awake listening to his wife's steady breathing. Sage's face was before his eyes, the taste of her lips haunting him. He tried to analyze the situation rationally, 15 years of marriage versus a few weeks of acquaintance, but reason was silent when it came to how he felt around Sage. At work, their interaction had become an agonizing dance. They carefully avoided touching, talked only about work, kept their distance, but sometimes their gazes met, and the air between them began to spark. Once, during an accident report, Sage was explaining something to the driver, and Merritt caught himself admiring her confident movements, the graceful tilt of her head, the way the wind played with a loose strand of hair. She intercepted his gaze, and for a moment the mask of professionalism slipped from her face, revealing the same agonizing longing. That evening, Aiden offered to host a dinner for Merritt's co-workers. "You've been quite distant lately. Maybe this will help you relax?" He declined more abruptly than he should have. Aiden recoiled, resentment flashing in her eyes. "What's going on with you, Merritt? It's like you've turned into a different person." "I'm sorry," he tried to soften the situation. "Just tired, a lot of work." But they both knew it was a lie. Something was irrevocably changing in their lives, like a crack in the glass that was getting wider every day. And Merritt didn't know if he wanted to stop the process. After each shift with Sage, he came home devastated. The struggle between duty and feeling was more exhausting than any pursuit of trespassers. and ahead loomed the inevitability of a choice on which he knew the fates of at least 3 people depended. The Pine Forest Motel stood 15 miles out of town. The old 2-story building, hidden behind a dense wall of trees, seemed forgotten by all. That was why Merritt had chosen it for his meetings with Sage. The receptionist, an elderly silent man, never asked questions when they rented a room on the 2nd floor. Their first intimacy happened after a particularly rough shift. They were chasing a drunk driver who had nearly hit a child in a crosswalk. Adrenaline was still bubbling in her blood when Sage parked the patrol car in a deserted parking lot near the woods. One look and all barriers had crumbled. Now they had their own rituals. Meetings after duty, stolen hours at the motel, long conversations in the semi-darkness of the room. Sage talked about her failed marriage, about suffocating in a small town in Oregon, about the dream of starting over. Merritt talked about the years he'd spent with Aiden, about how imperceptibly their love had turned into a habit. "I don't want to be your dirty secret," Sage had said once, lying on the narrow wash bed. "We can't hide forever." Merritt knew she was right. Every time he came home, he felt like a traitor. Aiden didn't deserve to be treated that way, but the thought of divorce, of scandal, of ruining a familiar life paralyzed him. At work, they'd learned the art of pretending. They kept a professional distance, communicated only on business, but colleagues still suspected something. Merritt noticed the leering glances, the sudden breakdown in conversation when they appeared. Aiden had changed too. She became more attentive, as if trying to pick up signs of what was going on with her husband. Started calling more often during duty hours, curious about his new partner. "How's Sage?" she'd ask, as if in passing. "You never talk about her." "We're doing okay," he answered, feeling his mouth dry up. One night, Aiden found a receipt from a coffee shop across town in his uniform pocket. "You never go to that neighborhood," she remarked. "There was a call," he lied, hating himself for that lie. Sage talked more and more about the future. She wanted certainty, plans, promises. Merritt understood her, but every such conversation made him panic. "I love you," she'd said once after a particularly passionate encounter, "but I won't wait forever for you to make up your mind." He came home particularly late that night. Aiden was waiting for him in the living room. "I've made an appointment with a marriage counselor," she informed him. "We need to talk about what's going on." Merritt looked at his wife, beautiful, devoted, patient, and felt everything inside clench with guilt. 15 years of life together, shared friends, habits, plans for the future. Is it possible to cross it all off for the sake of a new love? But when he saw Sage the next day, all doubts receded. She was like a breath of fresh air, like waking up from a long sleep. He felt alive next to her. Their clandestine meetings became increasingly risky. One day at a motel, they ran into a colleague from a neighboring precinct. He pretended not to notice them, but Merritt realized it was now a matter of time. Sage began to push for a solution. "I don't want to be a mistress. Either we're together, or we need to end things." Deep down, Merritt knew she was right. You can't live a double life forever. But the thought of the inevitable choice caused almost physical pain. At home, Aiden continued to pretend nothing was happening. She bought new linens, cooked his favorite meals, planned vacations. Every gesture of love she made was like a knife in his heart. "Do you love her?" Sage asked one day right in the middle of her shift. Merritt was silent for a long time, staring at the road. "I don't know if I still love Aiden, but I know I can't do it without you." That answer only seemed to strengthen Sage's resolve. She gave him a week to make a decision. "After that, I'm filing a transfer report. I can't do this anymore." Merritt understood the denouement was near, but he had no idea how tragic it would be. It was drizzling that afternoon. Merritt sat in their usual motel room and watched Sage pace the room. Her red hair was mussed and tears of rage stood in her eyes. "I'm tired, Merritt. Tired of being a shadow, a secret, a dirty story. You promised to solve this a month ago. How long can I wait?" He was silent, staring out the window at the rain-blurred pines. The last week had turned into a nightmare. Aiden had found strange messages on his phone. Rumors were flying around the precinct. The captain was calling him in for an informal conversation about office ethics. "I'm going to see the captain tomorrow." Sage's voice was ringing with tension. "And then I'll talk to your wife. Let everyone know what you're really like." "Don't do that!" The words came out hoarsely, almost pleading. "What do you suggest I do? Continue being your whore? Hide in motels? I love you, you idiot, but I can't do this anymore." She threw some kind of document at him. The papers scattered across the floor, a transfer report, already signed. "Either you leave your wife and we start a normal life, or I'll ruin your perfect lie. Choose." Merritt looked at the woman he loved more than life and felt something die inside. 15 years of service, the respect of his co-workers, marriage to Aiden. Everything he'd built over the years could crumble in an instant. "Give me time," he asked. "At least a week." "No," she shook her head. "No more postponements. I'm going to the captain's office at 9 tomorrow morning. Then I'll talk to Aiden in the evening. You can choose which order your life goes down in." He didn't sleep that night. He lay beside Aiden, sleeping peacefully, and thought about what needed to be done. The plan matured sometime before morning, clear, precise, scary. The next day was like a blurry nightmare. Morning briefing, routine patrol. Sage was unusually silent. At 8 p.m., she went on night duty. Alone, her partner had fallen ill unexpectedly. Merritt knew her patrol route, knew about the sharp turn at mile 47 where the guardrail had been damaged after a recent accident. He waited in the dark for the headlights of her car to appear on the road. His heart was pounding somewhere in his throat. The hands gripping the steering wheel were icy cold. The sound of impact, the scraping of metal, the splash of water below, in the river. It all took less than a minute. Then he stood under the hot shower for a long time, but he couldn't get warm. Aiden asked if he was sick. His face was white as chalk. "Just tired," he replied. "Tough shift." The call came at 4 in the morning. Rescuers found the body. The patrol car had smashed through a guardrail and gone into the river. Classic accident. Tired officer, slippery road, faulty guardrail. At the funeral, he was in the front row. Aiden held his hand, comforting him. She didn't know that every touch from her stung like fire. That evening, internal affairs detectives knocked on their door. Ramirez and Mackenzie. "Just a routine check," they said. "Standard procedure when an officer is killed." Merritt answered calmly and confidently. He was a good cop and knew how to conduct himself in an interrogation. But something in Detective Mackenzie's fixed gaze made him shudder inwardly. Nightmares plagued him at night. He'd seen Sage's face contorted with terror at the last moment. He heard the scraping of metal and the splashing of water. He woke up in a cold sweat and stared into the darkness for a long time, realizing that this was only the beginning. Her last words haunted him. "I love you, you idiot." She really did love, and died because of that love. And he just wanted to keep himself alive, not realizing he'd already lost her irrevocably. Detective Thorne Ramirez arrived on the scene at 6 a.m. The sky was just beginning to lighten, and forensics was already bustling around the broken fence. His partner, Blair Mackenzie, joined 10 minutes later, holding 2 cups of coffee. "What do we have?" she asked, holding one out to him. "Highway Patrol Officer Sage Donovan, 29 years old. Car went off a cliff at about 23:30. Rescue crews found the body at 4 in the morning." They stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down where rescuers were using ropes to pull the mangled patrol car out. Mackenzie crouched down, scrutinizing the marks on the pavement. "That's odd," she muttered. "No brake marks." The first thing they did was go to the precinct where Donovan served. The captain looked drained and aged. "Great officer," he said, going through Sage's personnel file. "Transferred to us 3 months ago. Brilliant credentials, no complaints. Any problems? Personal, professional?" The captain hesitated. "There have been rumors, but they're just rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "About an affair with a partner. Merritt Caldwell, 15 years seniority, married, but it's all talk." Mackenzie glanced over at Ramirez. They both knew that from rumor often stretched a thread to the truth. They found Caldwell at the shooting range. He was methodically putting bullet after bullet into a target, as if trying to prove something to himself. "We were partners," he said in an even voice. "Good cop, professional. You were the duty officer that night, Mackenzie observed. Yeah, patrolled the north sector. Didn't find out about the accident until the morning. His face remained impenetrable, but Ramirez noticed his fingers trembling on the grip of his gun. By evening, they had a whole board of evidence and questions. 15 witnesses interviewed, 3 versions of what had happened, and a strange feeling that something didn't add up. Look, Mackenzie spread out the photos from the scene. The fence. It was damaged a week ago in another accident. But why didn't she slow down? She knew about this area. And why was she alone? Ramirez added. Her partner was suddenly sick. Very convenient. They drove to Caldwell's widow's house. Aiden turned out to be a frail woman with tired eyes. Merritt is very worried, she said. She and Sage were good partners. Have you noticed anything unusual in your husband's behavior lately? She paused. He's become aloof. I thought it was because of work. Found some strange messages on his phone, but he said it was work-related. Back at the office, they studied the case files until late into the night. Something persistently bugged Mackenzie. Brake fluid, she said suddenly. We need to check the car's brake system. You don't think it's an accident? I don't know yet, but I have a feeling. There was a knock on the door. A young officer brought in the results of Donovan's phone forensics. Last call at 23:15, Ramirez said, looking over the report. Number blocked. Now that's interesting. Mackenzie pointed to a line in the report. The day before she died, she sent a transfer request and a letter to the captain. We need to find it. They didn't realize they were already on the killer's trail. They didn't know that every new question brought them closer to the terrible truth. And somewhere in the city, Merritt Caldwell sat in the dark, clutching a photograph of a red-haired woman, and realized the circle was narrowing. The investigation was just beginning, and it promised to be one of the most difficult of their careers. It was a chilly November morning. Detective Mackenzie was reviewing a week's worth of case files. Photographs and documents occupied the entire wall of her and Ramirez's office. In the center was a snapshot of Sage Donovan from her personnel file. Red hair, a confident half-smile, a clear gaze. On either side are charts, interview notes, forensic results. The door of the highway patrol station had been open and closed all day. Detectives were calling in everyone who'd worked with the dead woman for questioning. Young Officer Travis, Sage's academy partner, was nervously rubbing a button on his sleeve. She's changed in the last few months, became kind of closed off. We used to talk a lot after her shift, and then she started leaving right away. Dispatcher Martha, who'd worked at the station for 20 years, spoke confidently, as if she'd been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I saw them looking at each other, Caldwell and Donovan. It's not just the looks of partners. By noon, the detectives had accumulated more than a dozen similar statements. Sage began avoiding co-workers. Caldwell began staying late after his shift. They were often seen together at a coffee shop across town. Mackenzie studied the security cameras from the parking lot of the Pine Forest Motel, blurry silhouettes, fuzzy license plates. But even in the grainy footage, she could make out Caldwell's distinctive gait and his companion's red hair. Ramirez, meanwhile, was interviewing motel employees. The old receptionist remembered a couple renting a room on the second floor. Came once a week, sometimes more often, always in the evening, room 213. A new surprise awaited them in the technical examination room. The expert, a gray-haired man with glasses, showed the results of the examination of the braking system. Traces of mechanical impact. Someone intentionally damaged the brakes. This is no accident. They called Aiden Caldwell in again. This time, the interview took place in the formal setting of the station. She looked pale but kept her cool. I found this a week ago. She handed the detectives an envelope. Inside were pictures from the photo booth. Merritt and Sage, laughing, happy, in love. Why didn't they tell me sooner? Mackenzie asked. Wanted to save the marriage. Thought it would pass. In the evening, the detectives again surveyed the crash site. The setting sun was coloring the river blood red. Mackenzie crouched by the broken guardrail, studying the fresh paint marks on the metal. There was a second car here, she said. Look at the location of the pieces. In the light of the new evidence, the story was taking on an ominous shape. A secret affair, the threat of exposure, damaged brakes, second car at the scene of the accident. Ramirez pulled out his cell phone, dialing the prosecutor's number. "We need a warrant for Merritt Caldwell's arrest." At that moment, a call rang out in the front office. Aiden Caldwell was reporting her husband missing. He hadn't returned from his shift and wasn't answering his cell phone. The race against time was on. Somewhere in the city lurked a killer they knew by sight. A man whose picture hung on the police department's honor board. An officer who had broken not only the law, but every human principle. And in the detective's office, the photo of the red-haired woman whose only fault was that she had fallen in love with the wrong man was still staring off the wall. The first snow of winter was falling on the city, covering the streets and rooftops in a white shroud. Mackenzie stood at the window of her office, watching the snowflakes swirl in the light of the street lamps. Her third cup of coffee smoked on her desk, case files cluttered nearby. There was a knock at the door. An elderly woman who introduced herself as a maid at the Pine Forest Motel nervously rubbed the strap of a worn bag. "I used to clean room 213 every Thursday. They always left a generous tip. The woman sometimes cried I could hear through the wall, and one day they were having a big fight. He yelled something about his wife and his job." On Mackenzie's desk was a printed list of calls from Sage's cell phone. In the last weeks before her death, she'd often called from the same payphone outside the 24-hour pharmacy. The owner of the pharmacy remembered her well. Red-headed cop, always bought the same thing, sedatives and a pregnancy test. It was a new piece to their puzzle. Ramirez requested a medical report. The results came back 2 days later. Sage was 8 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. They found an unsent letter in Donovan's mailbox. In trembling handwriting, she wrote to her sister in Oregon, "I can't be a mistress anymore. He must make a choice. It will be decided tomorrow." The corridors of the police department had fallen silent by evening. Only the lights were still on in the tech department office. The expert was recovering deleted messages from the dead woman's cell phone. Scraps of correspondence formed a story of despair. "I can't be without you. I have to stop everything. I'm pregnant. We need to talk. I'll tell Aiden tomorrow. I'm sorry." The last message was sent an hour before she died. An unexpected confession came from Sergeant Morrison. The gray-haired veteran police officer asked to speak privately. "I saw Caldwell's car at mile 47 that night. Thought it was a routine patrol, but he was out of uniform, and he was in a hurry to get away when he saw me." On a map of the city, the detectives marked points: a motel, a drugstore, the place of death. In between them stretched invisible threads linking Sage's death to the man she loved. They found an ultrasound scan in her desk drawer. A tiny dot, a nascent life that was never meant to be born. On the back, in trembling handwriting, "Our baby, 8 weeks old." A waitress at a roadside cafe recalled their last encounter. She was crying. He grabbed her arm. There was even a bruise. He kept saying, "You can't do this to me." By evening, the puzzle was almost complete. Motive, opportunity, traces of the crime, everything pointed to Caldwell, but it was as if he had vanished into the snow swirl that covered the city. Mackenzie looked out the office window at the city at night. Somewhere out there, among the lights and snow, lurked the man who had turned love into a death trap. A killer in a police uniform. Someone who should have protected but chose to kill. Sage's picture still hung on the wall. The detectives now knew her story. The story of a woman who believed in love and paid for that belief with her life. The snowfall intensified toward evening. Ramirez and Mackenzie were returning from another crime scene inspection when dispatch reported Caldwell had been seen at an old dock on the outskirts of town. The abandoned dock greeted them with the creak of corroded faucets and the splash of black water. The floodlights of police cars picked out the icy bridges and the hulks of containers from the darkness. Caldwell's patrol car stood at the water's edge, dusted with fresh snow. They found him in the old control room. He was sitting at a gnarled desk with his service weapon in front of him. On the desk was a picture of Sage and a crumpled ultrasound scan. "I knew you'd come." His voice sounded tired and muffled. In the light of the handheld lantern, Caldwell's face seemed carved from gray stone. Deep shadows lingered beneath his eyes, and his temples were silvery with gray hair that hadn't been there a week ago. Mackenzie placed the evidence folder in front of him. Surveillance photos, phone records, forensics report on the damaged brakes, witness statements. "She was going to tell us everything," he continued without looking at the papers. About us, about the baby. I couldn't let that happen. The story flowed like a dam had burst. Their first meeting, casual touches, sneaking glances, secret meetings in a motel, a passion that clouded their judgment, and then Sage's ultimatum. She said either I leave my wife or she goes to the supervisor. I asked for time, I begged her to wait, but she was desperate. That evening, he followed her car. He waited on a deserted stretch of road, pulled up alongside, forced her to swerve into a damaged guardrail. One push, and it was over. You know what the worst part is? He looked up at the detectives. The moment the car went down, I was relieved. The blizzard outside the windows intensified, tossing prickly snow against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren howled. "I loved her," Caldwell whispered. "God, how I loved her." His hands reached for his gun, but Ramirez was quicker. The handcuffs clinked. As he was let out, snow covered his shoulders and hair in a white blanket. Reporters were already crowding behind the police cordon, camera flashes tearing through the darkness. In his jacket pocket, they found the last piece of evidence, a crumpled letter from Sage. "I'm sorry, love. I can't keep quiet any longer. Our child deserves a father who won't hide." At the station, Aiden met them with a petrified face. She watched her husband being led down the hallway, and there were no tears or anger in her eyes, just endless fatigue. Mackenzie sat at her desk for a long time, filling out a report. A love story turned into a crime story. 15 years of impeccable service undone by one decision. 2 lives ruined and 1 life cut short before it could begin. Snow continued to fall outside the window, covering the city in a white shroud of oblivion. But the memory of the red-haired woman whose love had cost her her life would long haunt those who knew the truth. The courtroom smelled of wood and dust. Sunlight streaming through the tall windows painted golden rectangles on the floor. Mackenzie sat in the front row, watching Merritt Caldwell take a seat on the bench. His uniform had changed to an orange prison jumpsuit, and there was a strange awkwardness in his once confident gait. Aiden sat across the aisle, straight as a string, wearing a strict black suit. Her face, framed by her wispy hair, seemed carved from ivory. She did not look at her husband. The prosecutor read out the charge. His voice echoed off the walls. First-degree premeditated murder, obstruction of justice, use of official position. There was such silence in the room that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Merritt's confession sounded muffled, as if from underwater. "It was raining that night. I followed her car from the station. She called, said she was on her way to Aiden's. I couldn't let that happen. 15 years of service, a reputation, a family. It would all fall apart. As she rounded a bend in the old road, I came up alongside her car. One bumper hit and it was all over. Someone in the audience sobbed. In the back row sat Sage's sister, who'd come from Oregon, the same red hair, the same stubborn chin. I heard the screech of brakes, saw the car smash through the guardrail, stood there until the headlights went out under the water. Then I drove home, to my wife, dinner, my life, like nothing had happened. Aiden rose to testify. Her voice shook, but her words came out clearly. I noticed changes, missing nights, strange phone calls, new perfume on my shirts. I thought it would go away. I didn't want to believe it. And then I found the pictures. I wish I'd told you sooner, if I hadn't kept silent. The judge read out the verdict, while spring rain began to fall outside the windows. The drops drummed on the glass as if counting down the years Caldwell would spend behind bars. Life without parole. Mackenzie met Aiden outside the courthouse. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the gray sky. "You know," Aiden said, looking off into the distance, "I loved him, didn't I? 15 years I loved him, and now I don't know who I loved. The man or the mask he wore." A year passed. Mackenzie came sometimes to the cemetery where Sage Donovan lay beneath the simple stone. She brought flowers, stood for long periods of time looking at the dates carved into the granite. She'd met Aiden there once, bringing white roses. They stood in silence, 2 women whose lives were linked by a tragic story of love and betrayal. Maple leaves rustled overhead and birds sang in the distance. In his prison cell, Merritt Caldwell pulled out a tattered photograph every night. A red-haired woman smiled from the glossy paper, and in her eyes froze eternal spring, the very spring he had taken from her. And at the police station, in the briefing room, a picture of Officer Sage Donovan hung among the photos of those killed in the line of duty. Young rookies often asked her story, and each time, the story served as a reminder to them of duty, of honor, of the cost of betrayal. The story is over. Justice had been served. But somewhere in the corridors of the station, footsteps are still sometimes heard, and the young officers say it is the soul of the red-haired woman whose love was stronger than death.